At 19 December 1944, 5:12 a.m., the last thing Dempsey saw before the world turned sideways was a muzzle flash. Not one, 12. They erupted from the ridgeline all at once, a synchronized wall of orange and gray smoke. And in the half-second between the flash and the sound, Staff Sergeant Roy Dempsey of the 1st Infantry Division pressed his body flat against the frozen Belgian earth and thought very clearly that he was already dead. He was wrong. But the men behind him were not. The date was December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes forest was minus 14 degrees Celsius. The Germans holding Hill 627 had been there for 11 days, and in that time they had repelled 3 separate American assault attempts, killing 41 men in the process. They had pre-zeroed their machine gun positions with the precision of engineers, and they had strung wire you couldn't see in daylight, let alone in the gray pre-dawn dark. They had a 20-millimeter flak gun pointed downhill, and that gun and flak Vierling 38, a 4-barreled anti-aircraft weapon turned against infantry, had chewed through a bar team 3 days earlier in under 4 seconds. Dempsey knew all of this before he went in. What he didn't know, what nobody told him, was that the Germans had doubled their garrison overnight. He had crawled forward with 16 men. Now he was flat in the dirt, alone, listening to the sound of his unit retreating through the trees behind him, following new orders he hadn't received, and ahead of him, above him, illuminated by a flickering parachute flare that turned the sky amber and cold, I was a fortified German position manned by over 60 SS infantrymen who had been awake for 4 hours, specifically waiting for someone like him. The Thompson submachine gun in his hands had a modification nobody in his platoon had ever seen before. 4 magazines welded into a cross-shaped bracket, a quad mag, as the men called it. 120 rounds without reloading. The Germans, later, would have a different name for it. But before they named it, they tried very hard to kill the man holding it. This is the story of how they failed. Roy Allen Dempsey was born in Morgantown, West Virginia, in 1921, the second of 5 children. His father worked the mines until his lungs wouldn't let him anymore. And after that, the family survived on piecework and whatever Roy could trap in the hills behind their house. He was not a large man, 5 feet 10, at 168 pounds when he enlisted, and that was after he'd been eating Army food for 6 weeks. The recruiting sergeant wrote "wiry" in the physical assessment, which was his way of saying the boy had no fat on him at all, just bone and sinew, and something behind the eyes that the sergeant couldn't classify. He volunteered in September 1942, 2 weeks after his brother Thomas was reported missing at Guadalcanal. Thomas came back eventually, but by then Roy was already gone. The men of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, knew Dempsey as Twice. The nickname came from his first action in North Africa, where he had been told to check a farmhouse for enemy presence, reported it clear, and then immediately turned around and went back in when something he couldn't explain told him he'd missed a room. He found 4 German soldiers asleep inside. He took them prisoner without firing a shot, using a combination of surprise, a fixed bayonet, and what his sergeant called the most alarming expression I have ever seen on a living human face. He never did anything once, his fire team leader Corporal Eddie Bassett said later. He always went back, always checked twice. That's just who he was. In the breast pocket of his field jacket, behind his dog tags, Dempsey carried a photograph. His girl, Mary Frances Holbrook, standing on the front porch of her parents' house in Morgantown, squinting against August sun, laughing at something just off the edge of the frame. On the back, in pencil, "Come home, Roy, and come home in one piece." He looked at that photograph every morning. Some mornings it was the first thing he did before he even put his boots on. That photograph was in his pocket on December 19th, 1944, when he pressed his face into the frozen mud of the Ardennes and listened to his unit retreat through the trees without him. He hadn't come this far to leave Mary Frances a folded flag. This video gives you the story. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details, forgotten heroes, full tactical breakdowns, stories that'll hit you harder than this one. Free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description. First issue is already waiting for you. The operation was called Falcon Break. Its objective was Hill 627, a forested ridgeline 6 kilometers northeast of Bastogne. The hill commanded a road junction that German forces had been using to funnel supplies and reinforcements toward the main Bulge offensive. American artillery needed line-of-sight observation on that junction. To get it, they needed the hill. To take the hill, they needed to remove the Germans on it. Before any of that, you need to understand what was on that hill. The garrison was Waffen-SS, specifically a reinforced platoon from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. These were not garrison troops. These were not rear echelon infantry. The men of Das Reich had fought at Kursk. They had held the line at Kharkov, while half the Eastern Front collapsed around them. Their commander on Hill 627 was SS Obersturmführer Klaus Reinhardt, 29 years old, and a decorated veteran of 4 years of continuous combat who had never surrendered a position he was ordered to hold. In the 11 days since they took Hill 627, Reinhardt's men had repelled 3 American assaults. The first, by a company of the 26th Infantry Regiment, had been stopped 200 meters from the wire with 22 casualties. The second, supported by a pair of M4 Sherman tanks, had been turned back when one tank threw a track on the frozen slope and the other pulled back to cover the retrieval. The third, a night assault by a reinforced platoon, had walked directly into Reinhardt's carefully prepared kill zones and been scattered in under 8 minutes, leaving 11 dead in the snow. Reinhardt had then calmly radioed his after-action report. "I'd requested resupply of ammunition for the MG-42 positions, which had fired over 3,000 rounds in those 11 days, and gone back to waiting." The intelligence report given to Dempsey's platoon commander, Lieutenant Harold Vesper, estimated the German garrison at 35 men, 1 heavy machine gun, 2 light MGs, 1 mortar section, a manageable force for a 16-man assault with fire support from 2 M1917 Browning .30 caliber teams positioned 500 meters to the south. That intelligence was wrong in almost every detail. It was wrong because 3 days earlier, on December 16th, the first day of the German offensive, Reinhardt had received a full reinforcement, a 28-man SS infantry section, additional MG 42 ammunition, a second 80mm mortar, and the flak Vierling 38. And the total garrison was now 63 men. The intelligence report reflected pre-reinforcement numbers. Nobody had updated it. Lieutenant Vesper led his 16 men out at 0 for 30 hours on December 19th. They moved in 2 columns through the forest, following a route that the intelligence report described as an unpatrolled gap between German observation posts. At 0512, when they were 400 meters from the wire and Dempsey's squad was in the lead, a tripwire flare ignited 20 meters to their left. The Germans had patrolled the gap. They had found the route. They had strung new wire in the last 48 hours. What happened next took 11 seconds. The flare lit the sky. An MG-42 opened from a position that was not on any of their maps. Then a second MG-42. Then the flak Vierling, and its 4 rotating barrels at 200 rounds per minute turned a birch tree 12 meters from Dempsey's position into splinters in the time it took him to blink. 3 men went down in the first burst, 2 more in the second. Lieutenant Vesper was on the radio shouting. What came back, what Dempsey would later describe in his after-action report as the worst words I have ever heard in my life, was not artillery support. It was a new order. Abort. Withdraw. A higher priority operation had begun to the south. The fire support teams were being redirected. The assault on Hill 627 was canceled, effective immediately. All elements were to fall back to the staging area. All elements. Vesper started pulling men back. Dempsey was already at the edge of the tree line, pressed against a boulder, 400 meters ahead of the rest of the platoon. He heard the radio call. He understood the order. He understood exactly what retreating meant. The hill stayed German for another day. The road junction stayed open, and whatever higher operation was happening to the south would lose its observation advantage. He also understood something the order didn't account for. He was too far forward. Retreating meant crossing 400 meters of open, flare-lit ground that 2 MG-42s and a flak Vierling were already scanning. Retreating, in that moment, was more likely to kill him than advancing. He had 12 30-round Thompson magazines, divided between his bandolier and his jacket. And he had the quad-mag bracket already locked on the weapon, a field modification made by a sergeant in the 18th Infantry, who'd gotten the idea from watching a German ammo carrier and never looked back. He had 4 M26 fragmentation grenades, 1 M1911 pistol with 2 magazines, and he had Hill 627 400 meters ahead of him, rising through the frozen dark. He checked his breast pocket once, felt the photograph through the fabric. Then he started moving forward. He went left. Not toward the main wire, that was where they expected any assault to come from, but along the tree line, hugging the shadow, moving in short rushes between the parachute flares. Each time the light died, he moved 10 meters, dropped, waited, listened. On the hill, SS Obersturmführer Reinhardt was at his command post, a sandbag dugout near the crest with a field phone line to each of his positions. He was not panicked. He was calculating. His men had triggered a flare, and an MG-42 had opened immediately. Textbook response. He had watched through field binoculars as the American patrol scattered back into the trees. He had counted the direction of retreat. He had also counted the Americans as they went back. 15. He counted 15 retreating figures. His original intelligence had suggested an assault element of 12 to 16 men. He had 15 retreating, which meant there were 1 to perhaps 2 men still in the darkness below his wire. Either dead in the snow, or... He picked up the field phone. "Muller," he said to his right flank MG-42 team, commanded by SS Unterscharführer Anton Müller, 22 years old, from Nuremberg, a 2-year veteran who had come to Das Reich from the Hitler Youth and had never, in his assessment, failed to hold a position. "I may have a man still forward. Flare pattern, southwest quadrant. Steady. Keep your finger off the trigger until you have a target." Muller acknowledged. He had good instincts. He had killed 12 Americans in 11 days. Not that he counted them. He almost killed Dempsey at 0531 hours, when a parachute flare caught Dempsey mid-crawl, 6 meters from a dead ground fold in the hill's slope. Muller's hand moved toward the trigger. Dempsey froze, completely, absolutely, in a way that should have been impossible for a human body. For 6 seconds, he did not breathe. The flare sputtered. The darkness came back. Muller had nothing. "Possibly shadows," he reported to Reinhardt. Dempsey was now 90 meters inside the German wire, in a position that the entire assault plan had never contemplated reaching. He was in a shallow drainage ditch that ran between 2 sandbagged fighting positions. He could hear German voices, low, professional, unhurried, 10 meters to his left. He could see the glow of a cigarette somewhere above him. He pressed himself flat, counted the positions he could identify by sound, and began to plan. Then the second MG-42 opened from a position 15 meters behind him. Not at him. Past him, at a shadow at the tree line, probably a branch moving in the wind. But the burst stitched the ground 3 meters to Dempsey's right, and the shock of it made him roll instinctively to his left, directly into the field of view of a German sentry he had not known was there. The sentry saw him, raised his MP-40, opened his mouth. What happened in the next 4 seconds is documented in Dempsey's own after-action account, corroborated by the physical evidence found at the position later that morning. Dempsey did not raise the Thompson. There was no time. He grabbed the sentry's weapon hand with his left hand, twisted, felt something give in the man's wrist, and simultaneously drove his right elbow into the man's throat with every gram of force he had. The MP-40 discharged once into the frozen ground. The sentry went down without a sound. Dempsey was on one knee in the open, Thompson now raised, heart slamming against his ribs, and the German position had just heard a single gunshot from inside their own wire. What he did in the next 90 seconds made no tactical sense. Every trained instinct said retreat or go to ground. He did neither. He went forward. And you will understand why. When you see what he had already seen in that drainage ditch that no one else on the battlefield could see. He had seen, in the brief flare-lit instant before the sentry spotted him, that the German fighting positions on the southwest face of the hill were oriented outward, toward the tree line, toward where the assault was supposed to come from. Their sandbags faced down the slope. Their fields of fire faced down the slope. Every position was built to repel an assault coming uphill from the south and west. Nobody had built a firing position facing inward. Nobody had planned for a man already inside the wire. This was a fortress designed to shoot outward. It had almost no defenses looking in. And he moved through the interior of the German position like a man walking through a house he had memorized in the dark. Micro Scene 1. The first MG-42 position was manned by 2 soldiers. They were watching the tree line. Dempsey came at them from behind and above, from the reverse slope of a fighting step they were standing in. He threw one grenade, an M26, into the position from 4 meters. He was flat before the burst. When he came up, the position was clear. The MG-42 was intact but inoperable, its traversal mechanism destroyed by the blast. He kept moving. On the German radio net, Reinhardt heard the explosion from inside his own wire and felt the first thing in 11 days that he did not have a ready classification for. "Where did that come from?" he said, not into the phone. To himself. Muller, at the right flank position, heard it too. He turned his gun inward and stared into the dark interior of the hillside position. He could see nothing. He radioed Reinhardt. "I think it came from Schaefer's position." "Reinhardt, how many Americans?" A long pause. Then, "I don't know, Herr Obersturmführer. I can't see anyone." That was the first crack. An SS Unterscharführer with 2 years of combat experience, who had never failed to identify a threat, was telling his commander he could not count the enemy. Micro Scene 2. Dempsey found the civilians at the second position. A stone farm cellar, partially collapsed, had been incorporated into the German defensive line as a storage space. Ammunition crates, extra MG-42 belts. And huddled in the far corner, wrapped in a single canvas tarpaulin, were 3 people. An elderly Belgian man, perhaps 65, with his hands crossed in his lap, with the stillness of a man who had decided to be calm because there was nothing else to be. A woman, his daughter, Dempsey guessed, maybe 30, clutching a child against her chest. A boy, perhaps 6 years old, with dark hair and enormous eyes that found Dempsey's face and stayed there. Dempsey froze for a full 3 seconds. It was 3 seconds he did not have. The woman made a sound, not a scream, something compressed, a sound forced through closed teeth by terror. The boy pressed his face into her shoulder. Dempsey held up one hand, open palm. He pointed at the far corner. He pressed his own back against the wall and held up 5 fingers, then pointed at his eyes, then outward. "Stay. I see you. 5 minutes." He didn't know if she spoke English. It didn't matter. She understood. What it cost him, his planned route through the eastern fighting positions, was now compromised. The cellar was between him and the next MG-42 emplacement. He would have to swing north, uphill, into the most exposed ground on the hill, directly below the command post, to get around it without risking fire near the civilians. He went north. It was slower. It was exposed. It was the only choice he could make and live with afterward. He took a round in the left forearm near the top of the slope, a grazing shot from a sentry who heard movement and fired at sound. The bullet opened a channel in his flesh 4 inches long without hitting bone. He kept moving. He packed the wound with a field dressing one-handed against the earth, pulling the knot tight with his teeth. 47 rounds remaining in the current quad-mag configuration. Micro Scene 3. He did something at the crest of the slope near the command post that none of the German soldiers who survived that night could later explain. He stopped. He lay completely still for 90 seconds in the open, between two fighting positions, with the German garrison visible on three sides. He was counting. He had gone over the terrain sketch from the intelligence brief, wrong as it was, 20 times before the mission. He was counting positions, comparing them to what he could hear, building in his head a map of what was actually on the hill versus what they'd been told. By the time he moved again, he knew where the mortar was. He knew which position had the 3rd MG-42, the one not on any map. He knew that the command post was to his right, not his left, because a field phone line ran across the frozen ground 12 inches from his nose. The irrational pause was the most rational thing he did all night. He followed the field phone wire. He stopped in a shallow shell scrape behind an ammunition storage position at approximately 0547 hours. 13 minutes since the flare had gone up. 13 minutes since his world had collapsed into this specific square meter of frozen Belgian ground. His left arm had stopped bleeding, mostly. His fingers were numb, not from the wound, but from the cold, which had been working on him since he'd stopped moving continuously, and the sweat under his jacket had started to freeze. He put the Thompson down beside him and pressed both hands flat against the ground, the way you do when you need them to stop shaking, and you don't want to know how badly they're shaking if you look at them. Somewhere below him, through the trees, his unit was in a staging area, 2 kilometers south, following orders he'd heard and chosen not to follow. They were probably being told he was dead. Vesper would count 15 retreating. He'd know someone hadn't come back. He'd do the math. Maybe they'd call artillery. Maybe the position would be flattened with him in it. And the story would simply be that Roy Dempsey of Morgantown, West Virginia, had followed his orders too far forward and was killed in the subsequent fire mission. Mary Frances would get a telegram. She'd stand on that porch where the photograph was taken, and there'd be no one just off the edge of the frame this time. Nobody to laugh toward. And she'd understand, without being told, that come home in one piece had been the wrong thing to ask for. He thought about the boy's eyes. Dark, wide, finding his face in the dark of that cellar, like a compass finding north. He thought about Corporal Bassett calling him twice. He always went back. He reached into his breast pocket, felt the photograph through the fabric. He didn't take it out. He just held it there, his palm flat against his chest, feeling the thin cardboard edge through 2 layers of wool and canvas. And he thought, you don't get to stop. Not here. Not with 3 civilians in that cellar, and a position still active. Not twice. This time, all the way through. He checked his remaining magazines. He counted his grenades. He mapped the last 3 positions he needed to reach. He picked up the Thompson. SS Obersturmführer Reinhardt had, by 0550 hours, 3 MG-42 positions that had stopped reporting and 1 that was reporting the wrong direction. He was a calm man. He had earned that calmness in 4 years of war. But what his remaining positions were telling him made no coherent tactical sense. The explosions, 3 now, all internal to the position, were coming from directions his defensive plan had no category for. He had reoriented 2 positions inward. He had sent his reserve section, 8 men, to sweep the interior of the hill. They found 1 American field dressing in the snow. Bloodstained, recent. 1 man, his reserve section leader, SS Scharführer Wolfgang Becker radioed back. His voice had something in it that Reinhardt had not heard from Becker before. Herr Obersturmführer, I think it is one man. Reinhardt did not respond immediately. He ran the sequence again. 3 internal explosions, 1 field dressing, no coordinated assault fire from the tree line, no suppression, no follow-on units. 1 man, inside his wire, moving through his position from within, in the dark, alone. His training had no manual for this. Find him, Reinhardt said. All available men. Inward facing. Find him now. He moved, fired, dropped, moved again. 30 meters, 20, 10. The third MG-42, the one not on the map, the one he'd located by listening, was in a position cut into the reverse slope, manned by 3 men. They were facing inward now, following Reinhardt's orders, but they were facing inward toward where Becker's sweep was coming from, not toward the exposed northern slope where Dempsey was moving. He came at them from above and to the east. 2 grenades. He threw them in a tight sequence, 3 seconds apart, the second following the first, before the first's smoke had cleared, so that any man who moved from the first blast moved into the second. He was flat in the rock scree, arms over his head, before the second one went. When he came up, the position was cleared. The MG-42 was intact. He stripped the ammunition belt, loaded it across his shoulders, kept moving. The irrational pause, the 90 seconds he'd spent motionless in the open, now paid its dividend. He knew exactly where the command post field phone line ran. He had followed it. He knew the command post was 12 meters ahead, on the other side of a sandbagged wall, and he knew that Reinhardt was in it. And he knew that taking Reinhardt's post took the position's coordination with it. Becker's sweep section was 40 meters behind him, moving through the interior. He heard Becker call out in German, links, links, left, left, and the sweep section adjusted toward the sound. It was the sound of the MG-42 burst that had cleared the third position. They were following the wrong echo. He was already at the command post wall. He came over the sandbags from above, from the uphill side, the side Reinhardt had never thought to defend, because the hill itself was the defense on that side. He came over, and he was inside, before any man in the room understood that something was happening. Reinhardt turned. He was a tall man, lean, and with the hollow cheeks of someone who had been in the field for a very long time. For one moment, one impossible moment, he and Dempsey looked at each other across 6 feet of frozen air. Hände hoch, Dempsey said. His German was not good, but those 2 words he had right. Reinhardt looked at the Thompson. He looked at Dempsey's face. He looked at the blood on the left sleeve, the frost on the jacket, the absolute stillness behind the eyes. He put his hands up. Dempsey zip-tied Reinhardt with communication wire. There was no zip tie. He used a length of the field phone line, which was close enough. He hit the radio and put it out of commission. He took Reinhardt's Walter P-38. Then he went to the firing port and fired a single burst from the Thompson, upward, and into the sky, the signal for objective secured that he had agreed with Vesper before the mission, knowing Vesper would have observation officers who might still be watching the hilltop. Then he went to the remaining fighting positions, 3 of them, with a total of 11 men, and moved through them in a pattern that Becker's sweep section, coming from behind, had just made into a crossfire that cut off every retreat. He moved through the last defensive line before the surviving Germans understood they were between two threats, and one of those threats was a sweep section they'd sent themselves. The defenders broke. Men abandoned fighting positions that were still intact, still armed, and ran for the reverse slope. He let them run. He stood in the center of the captured position, and in the gray dawn that was beginning to find its way through the Belgian pines, with 63 Germans worth of equipment around him, and 11 surviving enemy soldiers staring at him from the ground with their hands on their heads. He walked back to the cellar. The woman looked up when he pushed the door open. The boy's eyes found him again. That same needle-finding north quality. He pointed at the door. Out. It's clear. The old man stood first, nodded at Dempsey with the gravity of a man conferring a very serious honor. He said something in Flemish that Dempsey didn't understand. He understood it anyway. Then he sat down on an ammunition crate, pressed both hands against his thighs to stop the shaking, and waited for the U.S. Army to come up the hill and find out what had happened. One sentence of silence after the last shot. Let it breathe. The first Americans up the hill, at 0634 hours, were from a reconnaissance patrol sent forward after Reinhardt's command post went off the air. They expected to find a German position. What they found required a radio call back to battalion that the reporting sergeant later admitted he had to make twice because the officer on the other end kept asking him to repeat himself. 63-man SS garrison, 11 prisoners, 41 dead, 1 Flak Vierling 38 destroyed, 3 MG 42s destroyed, 1 captured with belt, 2 mortar sections destroyed, command post taken intact, 1 American, Staff Sergeant Roy Allen Dempsey, left forearm laceration, non-critical, frostbite 2nd degree, 2 fingers on the right hand, no other injuries recorded. And the battalion S2 officer, the intelligence officer, who would subsequently have a very uncomfortable week, walked the position for 40 minutes before he wrote a word. Then he wrote, "In 22 months of European theater operations, I have never seen a defended position of this strength reduced by a single operator. I'm not sure I have the correct forms for this. Now the Germans. In the POW compound at Liège, 3 weeks after the battle, an American interrogation officer sat across a table from Wolfgang Becker, SS Scharführer, 26 years old, veteran of Kursk and Kharkov, the man who had led the interior sweep that night. Standard post-action debrief. The officer asked how many Americans attacked Hill 627 on the morning of December 19th. Becker looked at the table for a long time. 1, he said. The officer looked up. 1? Becker met his eyes. I know how it sounds. He was asked what the assault felt like from inside the position. He thought carefully before he answered, in the manner of a man who is choosing words for accuracy rather than effect. He said, we had never lost a position. In 4 years. In Russia, in France, never. We knew how to hold. We knew what an assault felt like. We knew how to calculate it, reorient, respond. But this, he stopped, started again. We couldn't calculate it. We kept looking for the unit behind him. We thought we were being led, but there was no unit. There was only him, and he kept coming from directions that our position made impossible. He was asked about the Thompson modification, the 4-magazine bracket. Becker was quiet for a moment. "We heard it more than we saw it," he said. 4 magazines firing is a sound you don't forget. When men couldn't see him but could hear that sound coming from the interior, coming from inside our own wire, they stopped thinking clearly. He paused. "We called it Veerwind, forewind, because you couldn't find it. You could only hear it from everywhere." Reinhardt, in his own post-war deposition, given in 1947 to a U.S. Army historian, was asked directly what he thought in the moment he turned and saw Dempsey come over the sandbags of his command post. He was silent for several seconds. Then, "I thought, this man is not afraid of me. I had been in command of that position for 11 days, and I had made myself into something men were afraid of. And he looked at me as though I was simply an obstacle between him and the next thing he needed to do." Another pause. "It was the most frightening thing I have ever seen." He was asked if the Waffen-SS had a name for Dempsey among the survivors. "Der Mann, der nicht aufhört," Reinhardt said. "The man who does not stop." "Not because of the weapon," he added, "because of the look in his eyes when I put my hands up. He was not excited. He was not afraid. He looked at me like a man who still had work to finish." The 3 Belgian civilians, Etienne Moreau, 66, his daughter Hélène, 31, and her son Jacques, 6, were interviewed by a Red Cross representative in January 1945. Hélène Moreau was asked if she had been afraid when the American soldier entered the cellar the first time. She said, "He held up his hand, open, like this." She demonstrated, and I believed him. I don't know why. He was bleeding and covered in frost, and he looked like a man who had come through something terrible. But he held up his hand, and I believed him immediately. She was asked what she wanted to say to him, if she could. She didn't hesitate. "I want to say that he chose to come back for us. He didn't have to. He already had enough to do." Jacques Moreau was 6 years old. He said, when the Red Cross officer asked what he remembered, he had very still eyes. He thought about it. Still like when the water in a pond is still. Very deep. Not frightened. He was 6. And he had found the truest thing anyone said about Roy Dempsey that day. Staff Sergeant Roy Allen Dempsey was awarded the Medal of Honor on March 4th, 1945, in a ceremony at 1st Army Headquarters. The citation, signed by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, reads in part, "Staff Sergeant Dempsey, with complete disregard for his personal safety and in direct furtherance of the mission objectives, advanced alone against a fortified enemy position of superior strength after his unit was compelled to withdraw. Through extraordinary courage, tactical skill, and steadfast determination, he engaged and neutralized the enemy garrison, secured the objective, and protected the lives of 3 non-combatant Belgian civilians sheltering within the target area. His actions resulted in the capture of 11 enemy prisoners, the silencing of 3 heavy machine gun positions, and the destruction of 1 anti-aircraft artillery piece employed in the ground defense role. Staff Sergeant Dempsey's conduct on this date reflects the highest traditions of the military service and the United States Army. He came home to Morgantown in the summer of 1945. He was 23 years old. He walked up the front steps of the Holbrook House on a Tuesday afternoon in July and knocked on the door, and Mary Frances opened it and stood there looking at him for a long moment And then she said, "You still have all your pieces?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am, mostly." And she laughed, the same laugh from the photograph, the one aimed at something just off the edge of the frame. And that was that. He never spoke publicly about December 19th, 1944. Not in interviews, not at veterans' events, not to his children when they were old enough to ask. What he said, on the one occasion his eldest son pressed him, he was, "I just kept moving. That's all it was. Just kept moving." He was asked once, by a journalist, whether he had ever heard what the Germans said about him afterward. He said he hadn't. The journalist told him about Becker, and Reinhardt, and Vierwind, and der Mann, der nicht aufhört. He was quiet for a long time. "That's a heavy thing," he said finally, "to have a man who was trying to kill you say something like that." The road junction below Hill 627, once observation was established from the captured position, was brought under artillery fire within 2 hours of the Hill's capture. Supply traffic to the German Bulge offensive in that sector was disrupted for 9 days. Historians of the Ardennes campaign have noted that the loss of that junction during the critical resupply phase of the offensive had contributed to the failure of the German armor to reach its Phase 3 objectives. 1 man, 1 hill, 9 days. He was given the wrong intelligence. The numbers were wrong, the route was compromised, and the position was twice what anyone had told him he was walking into. His orders changed at the worst possible moment, when he was too far forward to retreat safely, too far committed to stop, and too alone to call for help. An enemy that had trained for 4 years, that had held that position against 3 previous assaults, that had more firepower and more men and more time to prepare. That enemy tried everything they had, in the dark, on frozen ground, with the full weight of the SS's professionalism behind them, and they couldn't stop him. He came back for the civilians when the mission already gave him reason not to. He went north, into the exposed ground, and took a bullet for it and packed the wound one-handed in the dark and kept moving. And when it was over, the men who tried hardest to kill him gave him a name. Not because they had to, not because someone asked them to, because when they tried to describe what happened on their hill on December 19th, 1944, there was no other word for it. Der Mann, der nicht aufhört. If you've worn a uniform, if you've been in a place where the plan fell apart and the orders contradicted themselves, and you were alone with the decision and the dark and whatever weight was in your chest pocket. You know this story. You know it. Not because you've heard it before, but because you know the feeling of pressing your hands flat against the earth until they stop shaking. You know what it costs to get up again. And you know, and better than anyone, that the men who describe it as simple, who say, "I just kept moving," are the ones who understand it most completely. If you've never carried that weight, this is what it looked like from the outside. An ordinary man from Morgantown, West Virginia, who went twice when once was enough, who believed a woman in a cellar when she needed to be believed, who followed a field phone wire in the dark and came over a sandbag wall and stood there with still eyes, while a decorated SS officer raised his hands. Not because he wasn't afraid, because he was, and he moved anyway, every single time. He kept the photograph, Mary Frances kept the promise. They were married in September 1945 in Morgantown, on the front porch of her parents' house in August's sun. She was laughing. He was just off the edge of the frame. He came home in one piece. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss these forgotten stories of extraordinary American courage. Who should we tell next? Drop their name in the comments.